Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Inside the Psychopathic Mind podcast. Again, it's Jason Smith with Carl Giacono. How are we today, Carl?
Jason, I always like these ones we do at Robin. We record in the evening. It feels more like Sunday night football than the football during the regular day. These are always
Yes,
different.
yes, a little different for us today. Today, or I guess tonight, we are going to be discussing the mysterious case of Cindy James. And we are recording this and we're going to post it on what would have been her 82nd birthday. So, to help us discuss the Cindy James case, this has been something some of our listeners have requested, seeing if Cindy James was a psychopath or not. We're going to kind of get a little bit into some of her mental health background and stuff like that. But again, returning to the podcast to help us delve into her case is the host and creator of the weekly true crime podcast, The Trail Went Cold, Robin Warder. Robin, welcome back. Thank you again.
Yes, thanks for having me.
All right, so I'll throw to you, Carl, and
Yes,
see what you want
Robin,
to kind of start with.
I keep analyzing and trying to figure you out because you do these cold cases. Now, you shared with me that some do get solved eventually, but that's kind of like the pigeon pecking that thing that occasionally gets a reward. So I don't know how you keep up the motivation, but I'm assuming maybe because a lot of these aren't solved, you just compulsively have to keep doing these. You're going to be doing these into old age.
Oh,
So,
yes, like
Jace,
I've said that I will never run out of material to cover on the podcast, which is not a good thing for the world in general, but at least there's no shortage of cold cases to talk about.
it keeps you going. With Jason and I, we usually get the cases that are already done. We can fit the pieces of the personality together and so forth and come up with pictures that make sense in the completed puzzle. But just before we turn it over to you, I'll just mention in the episode tonight, we're not really attempting to diagnose or assess anybody per se formally. We're just going to speculate and talk about personality dynamics and things that are consistent. For example, one of the things going into your narrative, Robin, that I think is important is to people that tend to stalk intimates. They tend to have narcissistic, borderline, and antisocial personalities. The cognitive component of them is often that if I can't have you, no one will. They also have the idea that I'm going to cause you to suffer like I did. And when you throw in the idea of bondage, then you get into the element of sadism. And not surprisingly, they have the same personality characteristics. And I think for the American US audience, they can at least think about some of the dynamics in the O.J. Simpson case and kind of how that played itself out in his personality characteristics. But at that point, since you've had so much experience, Robin, we'll turn it over to you for a narrative because you've been working on this case for many years.
Yes, I mentioned on my last appearance here that I was inspired to start The Trail Went Cold because I was a huge fan of the TV show Unsolved Mysteries, which aired on TV during the 80s and 90s. And this was one of the biggest cases they covered, and that's why I covered it on The Trail Went Cold all the way back in 2016. I believe it was episode number 18, and now I'm in like the 400s, so that shows what a long time it's been. And I'm also from Canada, and this was a case that made the Canadian media a lot when it happened in 1989. So I remember hearing about it a lot growing up. And it is definitely one of the more unique mysteries you'll ever find because it involves a woman named Cindy James who claimed that she was stalked and harassed and assaulted incessantly for 6.5 straight years from 1989 until 1982 until 1989. Yet every time she called the police, they could not find any evidence of a suspect, and things eventually got to the point where they thought she was mentally ill and staging the whole thing. And then in May of 1989, she disappeared, and 2 weeks later, they found her body in a vacant lot. She was tied up, hogtied, and had died from ingesting a combination of drugs. And the police were content to rule it out as a suicide, but they even had a big coroner's inquest to try to figure out was she actually stalked and murdered? Was this all an elaborate suicide? And the jury came to the conclusion that Cindy James died of a quote unquote unknown event, which is the most non-conclusive ending you can find. And so here we are nearly 40 years later, and we still don't know what actually happened to her and if she was the victim of foul play or just staged an elaborate suicide.
It's an interesting word there, Robin, when you said inconclusive, because when you read all this material about what the lie detector test is inconclusive, even though it showed at times that they didn't think she was lying, the knots and so forth that were tied inconclusive, that word comes up all the time in what people have written about this particular crime.
Yeah, this is what I think of as a case where it's virtually impossible to come up with a theory that makes 100% complete sense. And we were talking before we recorded how some people have the attitude that it's either or. Either she was harassed nonstop for 6.5 years before she was murdered, or she staged every single incident, literally hundreds of them, before she chose an elaborate suicide. But we're both inclined to believe that the truth may lie somewhere in the middle, where she was legitimately stalked for a while, then respond by lashing out by staging some incidents because she had suffered a mental breakdown and was so frustrated that the police stopped believing her, and then just decided to end it all. But when we talk about the circumstances of how she was found, she was missing for 2 weeks before her body was discovered, and it just seems impossible it could have been at that location the entire time without being seen. So it makes you wonder, was she somewhere else for a couple weeks before she was murdered and wound up at that location?
And they looked at the forensic evidence when they found her, sexual assault, inconclusive, the same kind of thing. But yes, with the mental status of her is very important because, if you have PTSD long enough and it's severe enough, you become paranoid and you develop these kind of symptoms that she was expressing. The other thing, she was on so many medications, and true, most of the medications she was on would increase depression and her suicidal thinking. At one point in the records, and they don't tell which ones, it says she was on some antipsychotics. And if you get on different antipsychotics and you're mixing certain kinds of medication, you can develop a syndrome called serotonin syndrome. And this basically, you become paranoid, suspicious, and you really have a breakdown because of that. So there's a lot of unanswered questions about her mental status, but it does seem what's clear is at some point she did have a mental breakdown. Now, whether that was just PTSD and her personality was somewhat vulnerable, I'm sure when the three of us looked at the records, there were statements that she tended to be gullible and naive. And when you look at pictures of her, that kind of comes out. And gullible and naive people tend to have more vulnerable personalities and make poor decisions in relationships. Now, we wouldn't base that just looking at a picture of her, but at least that stuff is consistent.
Yeah, I noticed that about the pictures is that you see photos of her from the 70s, early 80s. She looks like a very beautiful, vibrant woman who's just full of life. And then you see pictures of her in the mid to late 80s after she's been in psychiatric facilities and she's gone through all this trauma. And she looks like she has aged like 10 to 15 years, only, even though only 4 or 5 years have passed. And I think that's what's so tragic about this is that even if she wasn't being stalked, she was clearly going through her own personal hell. And you can't really accuse her of saying that she just did all this because she wanted attention. Because if that was the case, she certainly did not look like she was enjoying it. It just looked like she was suffering nonstop for 6.5 straight years.
Kind of treatment she got, Robin, because in the one thing there was a reference in some of the readings that Dr. Marcus, I believe his name was doing some of the treatment. Who apparently he was a colleague or a friend of Roy Makepeace, who was her husband. So I mean, what was going on? And then people would make comments about kind of her background and her childhood history without really interviewing and talking about that, just as if they're making assumptions. So you kind of begin to wonder actually what type of treatment did she actually get?
Yeah, I was doing a lot of research before we did this, and when I did my Trail and Cold episode nearly 10 years ago, it's one of those ones where I kind of wish I could redo it because I didn't go through many resources as I would now, because back then I didn't have access to like a lot of digital books. I didn't have access to newspapers.com. So I actually learned a lot about the case while I was preparing for this episode, which I did not know before, by reading a couple books that are available digitally online that were written about the case during the the early 1990s, and I learned a lot about her childhood history. And for years, I had heard rumors that she had accused her father and one of her brothers of sexually molesting her. But it does not look like there's any corroborating evidence for that because, from what I read in the book, I know that her father, Otto Hack, he was known for being a strict disciplinarian who believed in corporal punishment, who would sometimes spank his kids and give them the strap. But by all accounts, that was a lot more common back during the 40s and 50s, so it didn't really cross the line into what was considered to be abuse at the time. And it does sound like Cindy's relationship with her father was complicated, but I've never seen any evidence that he struck her or sexually molested her. And she apparently told her husband, Roy Makepeace, and at least one of her psychiatrists, that she had been molested by her father and one of her brothers, but everyone else from her family seemed to deny it. So we really don't know if that actually happened and where this came from.
Of information that's inconclusive. You could almost label that as part of this case. We're going to find out about more things, I think.
Yeah, pretty much, because there's a lot in this case where you'll read about it online and kind of accept it as fact, but then when you read books about it and start going through a lot of the documents, you're like, sounds like this is just rumor and speculation. We don't know if this is actually true.
So what other
Exactly.
stuff did you kind of, I guess, come up with or learn about that maybe you didn't have 10 years ago, Robin? Any other fun things that you learned about?
Well, an interesting thing that I did not know, which could point to her having some sort of mental illness, is that during the 1960s, she was attending nursing school in Vancouver. And because her father had re-enlisted with the Air Force, he got transferred over to France alongside Cindy's mother. So they only saw each other occasionally and they wrote to each other. And apparently, during one of her letters, Cindy announced that she had been dating this unnamed intern who was going to her school, but she never actually mentioned his name and said that they were engaged to be married. But then all of a sudden, she sent another letter to them saying that he found out that he had terminal cancer and that when they were together on a skiing trip, he decided to walk off into a cabin in the woods and kill himself with a self-inflicted gunshot wound. But what's interesting is that the family never found out who this guy's name. They never found any corroborating evidence, any documentation about a suicide in a cabin in the woods. So we don't actually know if this guy existed. If she maybe just made this up, like as some sort of weird fantasy because her parents wouldn't learn the truth. And shortly thereafter, she actually did get married to a guy we just talked about, Roy Makepeace, but her family didn't approve of him because he was 18 years older than her and she was only 20 years old at the time. So it is kind of weird that she makes up this story about like a fiance who committed suicide before she got married for real, and we don't even know if this guy actually existed.
And those are interesting because other things come up, not related to that, but in general with her relationship with her parents. Like, what was this impression management? What was she trying to do? And this is a rhetorical question. In her relationship with them, how was she trying to appear to them? What was the reason for some of these things? Just the fact that she probably didn't tell them. I don't think she told them right away about Roy Makepeace, but when they found out about it and the age difference and so forth. And even if you look then at the things that happened to her. At times, it says in the records that she was guarded about revealing who she thought was stalking her. And then at other times, she said it. So there's that kind of, I don't know what you call it, a built in suspiciousness or something in her managing kind of what people think of her.
Yeah, and it really seems like she was someone who always like desired her father's approval because he was very old school. He apparently treated the men in the family a lot better than the women, his sons better than his daughters, because he had the mentality that the women in the family should always do what the men said. And his wife was apparently very complacent and pretty much like did whatever Otto told her to do. And it's kind of interesting how at first they didn't approve of Roy Makepeace because of the age difference, but apparently once Otto and Roy got to know each other, they started getting along at first because because they found out they had a lot in common. There was only a 4-year age difference. And of course, their relationship would deteriorate many years later when they got divorced and they started to suspect that Roy was behind a lot of the attacks on Cindy. But at the time, I think some of her sisters were speculating, you're marrying a guy who's older than you and has a number of similarities to your own father. So what kind of psychology was going on there that maybe that's the reason she chose this guy, even though they didn't really
Interesting.
mesh well at all?
Well, did you ever find out anything about Makepeace's why he had been denied a medical license on at least two occasions? I could not find anything related to that.
I couldn't know. It seems like there's a lot of very mysterious stuff surrounding his background where I've heard a lot of uncorroborated rumors, but very few facts.
Yeah, it seems like when you read, you try to find out about him and they deflect it back to talk about her. And there's like dead ends to the information about him. But certainly his style and the way he came across, there's something there that did you see anything in the literature about people going to his house later and him having guns or talking to them through the peephole and so forth?
Oh, I didn't hear about that. No, did you read that?
Yes, that it sounded like, and I don't know, Jason, if you picked up anything about his style, but there was something about when he would be questioned and stuff, he had a way of turning it around towards him. Um, yeah, this is vague. I don't have more specific to say about that.
He
But
has
I know
passed away too, right?
yeah, he
I
died a long
think.
time ago because
Yeah.
he would have been around in his 60s about the time that Cindy died. So I think he died in 2013 of cancer.
Yeah. Okay.
It also adds to the story is apparently he was a colleague with another psychiatrist named what was his name? James Tyhurst, who I think had
Yeah,
been accused of several patients of kind of having them sign waivers and things to participate in sadomasochistic behavior and so forth. And I think you
yeah,
may have
this is
information.
Yeah,
Go
this is
ahead.
one of the weirdest parts of this whole story is that all we know for certain is that Roy Makepeace and James Tyhurst were on the faculty together at the University of British Columbia in the 60s and knew each other, but it seems there are a lot of uncorroborated rumors online that he knew Cindy James and may have played a role in what happened to her. We talked about how I always frequent this message board for Unsolved Mysteries fans where they have some extensive discussions about Cindy's case. And during the mid 2000s, one of the posters there was Cindy's sister, Melanie, who shared a very weird email that she had received from someone because for years Cindy had talked about how she remembered going to an island with Roy Makepeace and had to witness a murder in which two people were butchered. And this emailer told Melanie that this person that she was referring to who was responsible for these murders was James Tyhurst. And we know that Tyhurst years later would be arrested for sexually assaulting some of his female patients. There's an entire book written about him, but I have not been able to find any hard evidence or corroboration that he actually knew Cindy.
That's a lot. It's like the same thing with Makepeace, is you get so far, but you can't find out more about his personality because it seems like no one was. It seems like the police and everything were focused on Cindy and believed she was faking and so forth. And there was less information about these kind of things we just talked about. Makepeace's personality and also this connection with Tyhurst. Yes, I happened to be able to talk to somebody that was on faculty up there, and this individual shared with me the idea that when they went to remove him, they had to take him out of the university. He wouldn't leave. So this guy had a lot of things going on that separate, even though we don't know in a substantiated manner his connection or involvement, but certainly adds to the mystery around the whole story.
And another big unanswered question in this case is it's easy to forget that she didn't actually start going by the name Cindy James until 1985. She went by her main name, Cindy Hack, or her married name, Cindy Makepeace. But in 1985, because she was being stalked, she moved into a new location and changed her name to Cindy James. And to this day, her family doesn't know why she chose that as her last name. But apparently, there are conspiracy theories that she might have chosen James because of a connection to James Tyhurst.
This speaks to the case that there's lots of conspiracy theories. You have to have a case that's well documented, everyone's talking about to begin. And it's one of the things that makes it difficult to sort through the information. all the unsubstantiated issues, the things that are inconclusive. For instance, the crime scene, the forensic evidence, when they found the body, inconclusive that she was sexually assaulted, even though once again she was tied with these black nylon stockings. This becomes interesting throughout the other times, where she has a black nylon stocking around her neck. Because if this is kind of something that was the result of someone else, this could be a signature, something they use in their behavior and what they're doing to people, the black nylon stocking. The other thing about it that makes it interesting regarding that, and also the forensic evidence with the finding the body, is, see, if you look at the FBI's classification for disorganized and organized offenders, this was Ressler, Hazelwood, Burgess, Douglas kind of talked a lot about that. The organized killer will tend to stalk their victims. They may pick up the person in one place and dump the body somewhere else. And so there was a lot of elements of this case that sounds like whoever was hassling her and also whoever actually murdered her was more organized. Because I think, Robin, I don't know if you found this or you did, Jason, but they said it was inconclusive. Some people thought the body was, that was the actual crime scene where they found the body, but there was a lot of evidence with people around and such that it doesn't really sound plausible. It sounds like the body was dumped.
Yeah, I know that there were some kids who had a party in an abandoned house very close to where the body was found during the week 2 weeks that she was missing, and they didn't recall seeing her. And there was a transient who lived in a van in that area, like only something like maybe 50 feet from that spot, and he didn't recall seeing her until the day she was discovered. And she was partially decomposed, but he didn't remember having any rotting smell or anything like that. Didn't remember like noticing any stench. And they have a Canadian news magazine program called W5, which aired a segment on this case in the early 90s. And Ozzy Caban, a private investigator that Cindy hired, who's a big figure in this case, he actually took the camera crew out to the spot and pointed at the road, and you could see like how heavily trafficked it was. It was a very busy roadway where cars were passing by nonstop, and he just pretty much pointed out, do you really think that someone could lie in this lot for over 2 weeks and none of the passing motorists saw her?
Yes. Well, see, we didn't want to move you ahead in your narrative and interrupt it, but then you get into the knot time. And at least the guy that was a mountain climber that they brought in once or twice said there's no way she could have tied these things herself. But they found some expert or something to say that it was plausible. But given, in my opinion, even though that I don't know much about knot tying, when they said how deeply the knots and how it was tied, it wasn't loose. It was tied very firmly. It doesn't sound like someone could have done that, particularly if they were taking all these medications that they found her, to have taken or given.
Yeah, like that's always been one of the debates because they have said that if she ingested these medications, we would have had 10 to 15 minutes to tie herself up before she passed out. Or maybe she somehow like just kept the pills in her mouth or something like that and didn't swallow until after she was already tied up. But the biggest flaw in the logic is that this was done by a not expert who obviously is going to know better than most individuals how to tie yourself up and get yourself into that position, but there's nothing to indicate that Cindy was a not expert. So just because this guy could do it doesn't mean she could. Mm-hmm.
That's it. That's the logic that they don't account for or don't use when they look at that.
And I know there was an earlier incident in the mid 80s, like one of the times where she was assaulted but not killed, where I think one of the paramedics who removed a rope that was around her neck said it was just so tight that it was almost impossible for them to get it off. And they were saying to themselves, if I can't get it off, how could Cindy have got it on herself in the first place unless it was an outside party who did it?
See, unfortunately, what confounds this and makes it more difficult, and I can remember an experience doing forensic evals when I was down in Austin, Texas, and doing custody evals. You'd often have a case where basically the psychologist that evaluated the case would not be very competent, and they'd get locked into the male in the case. The husband would be like an attorney, came across very well, didn't mean they were narcissistic, paranoid, and so forth, but the woman would have more emotionality. She might have a personality disorder, but she certainly wasn't psychotic. And the inexperienced examiners would discount her because of her emotionality. And I think in this particular case, a lot of that happened with the police and Cindy, because, the same thing. Law enforcement tends to think, okay, you catch you in one lie, then you're lying across the board. But her personality in this, uh, we'd be, for people that are still researching the case, it would be a mistake to get caught into that the false dichotomy, either or. It's quite likely that the stalking and so forth would have contributed to severe PTSD. Who knows exactly what medication she was taking, and that she was stalked and did have mental problems too. And who knows if somewhere along the line, like an individual thing, like you probably both of you remember when she set the fire, and that was kind of inconclusive, or they thought someone set a fire. Well, under so much stress and losing her mind and no one paying attention to her, I could see her doing something like that, but that would not discount the reality of all these other incidents. I think
Well,
that, go ahead.
ironically, the incident with the fire is one of the ones where I do think she started it herself, but it is also one of the few incidents where there was a potential suspect seen at the scene. Because in this incident, she was staying at the house of a couple that were friends of hers, Tom and Agnes Woodcock, and a fire just suddenly started in the basement. And when the police arrived, they said there were no signs of any break-in. There was dust that was undisturbed on the windowsill. So it seemed very likely that it was started by someone inside the house, and most likely the most logical suspect is Cindy. But Tom Woodcock also said that when he ran out, he saw a man standing outside and asked him to go call the police because there was a fire. And without saying anything, this guy just ran away. And this was like 3 o'clock in the morning. So why is there this random guy standing outside the house? So it's kind of ironic because I really do think there's a good chance Cindy did this, but why was there someone else at the scene who just didn't want to get involved and called the police?
That's one of so many things like that. Why and things they dismiss that seem like there must be something more there. I'm sure you saw that at least on one example. I think it was that investigator you mentioned that he found Roy Makepeace out in a car outside of her house, in which his Makepeace said that something like, "Well, I'm watching to make sure everything's okay." And he presented this idea that he thought the mafia was out to get her or something else,
Hmm.
which seems kind of implausible.
Yeah, like I don't know where that came from. It does seem like he's deflecting, like trying to come up with an alternate theory if he was involved. But yeah, I don't think he ever gave any real context for why he said that. I think it was just because she worked at a group home, he said, for like disadvantaged children. But I don't know why that would make you a target of the mafia.
See, there were so many things that it's reported he said that, like I said, you don't know if there's more information there or people just didn't bother to track that information down at the time. And who knows, that may be lost forever, those kind of pieces.
I think didn't she like go undercover with a wire on, like, and have like a try to get him to like confess or something? I think I read something like that, and he didn't. I don't know. I think I saw something where Cindy
Yes, that
went to try to
happened,
do that.
Jason.
Yeah, yeah.
I
And
forget
there was
the
a separate
outcome.
And there was also, I think her father, Otto, did it as well, like had a
Okay.
meeting with Roy while he was wired, and in neither case did he say anything incriminating. So who knows? Maybe he sensed that maybe the police are watching her all the time and knew that he had to keep his mouth shut.
Well, I think that's an interesting one too, right? So every time the police would watch, and then like after they would like surveillance the house, nothing would happen, and then like when they leave, within a day or two, it seems like something then happened to her, right? Wasn't that also of a pattern that kind of happened as well?
Yeah, like that's one of the reasons that the police thought that she was faking everything, that because whenever they put surveillance on her, nothing would happen. And then miraculously, once they left, the attacks would start again. But that always leaves me so frustrated because if they wanted to catch her in the act and make sure that she was doing all this, the most obvious solution would be to call Cindy's bluff and just say, well, we're leaving now. We're not going to have any more surveillance, but still watch her. And if she thought they were gone and she started staging these attacks on herself, they could finally catch her. But the fact that this didn't happen once, where they suspected it, but no one actually caught her doing anything, is just one of those things that makes me pull my hair out, where it's like, how could she have kept this up for 6.5 years?
Robin, there's just so much like that. What did you two guys think about the idea that Makepeace produces some recording where people made calls to him and they seem to accept that as valid. I mean, you can hire somebody to do that, or that they just seem to accept that. Much of the stuff that came from him, they just seem to accept on the surface, at least the way it's written in the literature.
I think
Yeah,
all
that
the
is.
recordings too, like, she got a lot of recordings too. That was a big thing as well, right? So,
Yeah, the only recording that has ever been released publicly is one that was left on Makepeace's answering machine, where this raspy voice is saying, Cindy, Dad, me, soon. And a lot of people have suspected that it's a woman disguising her voice, pretending to be a man, so that's why they think that Cindy did it. But like you just said, for all we know, he could have gotten someone else to leave it on his behalf so that he could pitch the blame on Cindy and tell the police that, oh, she's faking the whole thing.
Yeah, I remember one time I was doing a presentation and teaching people about psychopathy. And the subject for my interview, they gave some guy, homeless guy, a pack of cigarettes and brought him in. So you can certainly, if you have money, find somebody to do a recording. I mean, you're going to find somebody somewhere to do something. But I don't know if maybe the police did more questioning than we ever know about, or maybe they didn't about all these things with Makepeace.
I think the estimate was like they spent like 1 to 1.5 million dollars on the case. So you would hope they would have done something for that money, I guess, but they never caught anybody.
And that was the thing is that after this inquest ended in 1990 and they determined that she died of an unknown event, like they didn't officially say her death was a suicide. They pretty much recommended keep the case open. We don't know if it's a homicide, but keep looking into this. But they had spent so much money at that point and it had been such a bad PR nightmare that they pretty much put it to the side. And I don't think there's ever been an official investigation ever since then. And here we are 36 years later, 37 years later, and we still don't have any insight on what might have happened.
And I
That's not
think,
satisfying.
yeah, that's not satisfying at all.
No, no.
Uh, and I think to go to that other point, he could hire. So I think, wasn't he out of t the country or something when one of the incidents happened? And then they were like, oh, look, he couldn't do it because he was out of the country when something happened to her. But again, they could go back, you could hire somebody else, or there was a second person involved. There's just so much information over the 6.5 years. It's just tough to piece it together.
I know that in the early stages of the stalking, there was a neighbor of Cindy's who said that she saw a strange man standing in Cindy's yard on at least three occasions, and he didn't actually do anything, so we don't know if he was involved. But she also specifically said it was not Roy Makepeace. It didn't look like him. So if there were multiple people involved, then maybe he sent someone else there to like stalk Cindy and stare at her. So, like you said, just because he's out of the country does not mean that he couldn't have been responsible for some of the attacks.
And I know she's like, I guess she said sometimes she knew who it was or didn't know who it was, but then she was scared because her family was threatened and things like that. So um yeah, that if she knew who it was, she never mentioned who or told anybody who she thought it was.
Yeah, I don't think there was like one incident where she flat out said that I saw Roy, my ex-husband, attack me. And she was kind of implying that she knew the identity of the person attacking her. But I know at least one occasion she said this person told me that he would attack my sister or other members of my family if I told the police anything. So that's why she was very evasive. So it could be a thing where she suspected her ex-husband, but she was being attacked by someone else and either didn't want to give their name or just didn't know who it was.
And you said you went on these other sites and kind of picked up information, things people say. That on these other sites, did anyone ever speculate about something additional that we're not talking about?
Well, we were talking. I think I showed you a website that was started by Cindy's sister, Melanie
Yes.
Hack, and she was going to publish a book, I think, called Who Killed My Sister. But I think she finished it because she, I think, put an excerpt of a chapter on her website, but the book has never been published, even though I think a lot of these posts are over 10 years old. And of course, she is the one who's posted all these rumors about James Tyhurst possibly involved. So I've always wondered maybe if she couldn't publish the book for legal reasons, that maybe she was going to implicate people where she thought she was going to be sued or something or open a can of worms, and that's why the book never came out.
Please. Well, yes, when you gave me that information, I actually emailed her a couple times, but didn't hear from her to see if she could give me some anonymous information so I could sleep better at night. I was actually up several nights trying to solve these puzzles, which you can't solve.
Yeah, that's kind of funny because my editor, McGill, he when he puts my podcast episodes
Yeah.
together for me, he usually doesn't have a lot of advanced knowledge of the story, so he's learning the information as he goes along. And when he edited my original episode on the Cindy James case, he was home alone at night. His wife was out of town, and he said this is the only time he just got so scared by what he was learning that he had to take a break because, like editing a story about having a stalker outside who's like killing your cat or like breaking into your house and trying to attack you, it just kind of freaked him out and says, I think I'm going to continue editing this tomorrow morning in broad daylight. And even though he's edited nearly 500 episodes, I think that is the only time it's ever happened where he just got so frightened.
That voicemail
No,
is pretty frightening that I think you played on that episode. So I can see maybe his feelings behind that.
Yeah,
we
I think
talk
that's
about it. I'll go ahead, Robin.
yeah, I think that's the first part of the episode. It starts right off with the voicemail with no warning, so it freaks a
Yeah.
lot of people out.
We're talking a lot about the case. I never want to lose sight of the tragedy of this young lady because
Hmm.
it's likely her life just going through all this thing, just terrible, not being listened to. And it's quite likely she was stalked, and it's quite likely things didn't happen. And then ultimately leading to her death.
Yeah.
Um, and then us not being able to solve the problem and not having really any justice.
And that's what's so frustrating is that if it was actually a suicide and there was no one else involved, then there was no way for her family to know for sure because there wouldn't be any other witnesses. So I can see why they can cling so hard to the idea that she was stalked and murdered because that would mean that there's someone else out there who does know the truth and could give them a little bit of closure. But yeah, it's just when you in most of the cases I cover where people are murdered like this, it's like over in an instant. But you're not going to find too many other cases where someone goes through nonstop torment for 6.5 years.
And it is speculation, but if it was a suicide, I would have expected her to end up in her own apartment, ODing on all these medications she had stockpiled and so forth, not bound, not in a bondage, hogtied kind of situation. So it
Maybe a
really
note,
doesn't.
a note blaming the police for not listening to her or not giving, something along those lines. Yeah.
And just so many creepy details about the circumstances of how she disappeared because her car was found abandoned in a supermarket parking lot after she had bought some groceries and they found blood on the door. So it looked like it was an abduction. But if she staged the thing, did she cut her own hand and then wipe it on the door just to like make it look like she was a victim of foul play? And where did she go afterwards? Because it just seems unlikely that she went straight to that lot and overdosed. She had to have hid out for at least a couple days before she wound up there. I mean, another possibility is that she did overdose and someone decided to dump her body in that lot, even if they didn't actually kill her. There are just so many different scenarios, but no conclusive evidence pointing towards any of them.
I don't think they
I,
did any analysis of the blood or anything, right? So, like,
I
was it
think
hers?
it was hers, Jason.
It was hers. Okay.
They, I thought they might have checked that.
I think they did and determine it was hers, but this was
Okay.
still pre-DNA, and I'm thinking if this had happened today, we might have more conclusive answers because they could check like the knots on the stocking that she was tied up with
Yeah.
and the ropes just to see if there was any DNA
DNA.
belonging to an outside individual. And obviously, if they only found Cindy's DNA, then that would be conclusively evidence that she did it to herself. But back in 1989, they just didn't have the technology to check all this stuff.
And if you found out anything new about this, what I'm going to say, Robin, it was very disappointing to do some research about the knots. Apparently, from knots, you can't tell if the person's right-handed, left-handed, or you can't really tell much unless I imagine it's kind of a signature knot that only a sailor out of Sherlock Holmes, could be able to tie. So that you can't get a lot of information apparently from the knot itself. Like
Yeah,
you
I was
said,
in
maybe DNA perhaps, but the actual way the knot's tied and so forth. Do you find
yeah,
out?
didn't really find anything. And it's like if the police had suspected she was foul play, then maybe they could have checked MOs and profiles from other unsolved homicides from British Columbia during that time period. But because they just wrote it off as a suicide, I have a feeling they didn't try to compare the knots with any other known murders.
It would have been good, Jason, that guy we're going to interview in the future that runs a crime lab, especially Leighton Prince. We could have had him on and asked him about all this stuff too. Maybe he could have
Yeah.
given us something.
I wonder, I wonder if they've kept the evidence of any note ropes that they found or anything like that. Like you said, it doesn't seem like there's been any progress, right? Since the night after that inquest, they kind of just said it costs too much money. I wonder, yeah, if there's some cold cases or people can pull up some old cases or something like that from the area and see. It would be nice, to get some closure. It seems like it ripped the country for quite a while. So
That's,
So
I maybe we should all. Do we all have much more to say, or should we get some? Because I have a question that's kind of more towards the closing.
Well, one thing I wanted to mention about solving this case is that a pattern I've seen in a lot of the cold cases that I've seen solved in recent years is you sometimes just have to get the right investigator because at the time after Cindy died, I think the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, was just content to just put it aside and forget about it because they didn't think a crime took place. But maybe one of these days they will hire that young, hungry investigator who wants to take a fresh look at this case. And if they still have the evidence on file, they could test it for DNA or something like that, and then maybe get conclusive answers. So sometimes a lot of these cases don't get solved until the old guard retires or dies out because they don't want to look bad. So it's like the fresh faces who have nothing to lose who want to get to the truth.
So any
Anticipated what
listeners
I
or
was going to say.
watchers, feel free to send it to the Canadian Police and see if we can get some hits.
But you anticipate exactly what I was going to say. I was going to throw it out to all of us. Does anyone think this crime will ever be solved? And if so, how? So you just answered that. So maybe
Okay.
before I make my comment, Jason, what about you?
Well, the
Reviewing it.
last thing I want to talk about is, obviously we talk about psychopathy a lot, and people have maybe speculated Cindy James was a female psychopath. I guess if you're on that she made all this up for 6.5 years and did some of that stuff, and I think some of the reports or some of the investigations, though we really didn't see, me and Carl, when we looked at it, some borderline personality or hysterical personality disorder, which would be histrionic. And I know we've talked about on this podcast, female psychopathy has traits of borderline and histrionic personality disorder. We just really didn't see psychopathy in this case. So I
Oh,
really,
I
even though
mean,
there's some stuff, maybe I think it's more trauma, more depression, more
what is
paranoia
she
kind of with
what
that.
is she doing to hurt other people for one? Does she have a juvenile history of getting into trouble and acting out? No, this seems like along the lines of what you're saying, Jason. Maybe a vulnerable personality with a lot of post-traumatic stress, maybe substances and further deterioration in the functioning. But no, I don't see psychopathy here either.
Yeah, and I can see how some of our listeners or viewers could be confused if they read she had borderline or histrionic or hysterical personality. Be like, oh, those two things are in female psychopathy, must be coming to the conclusion. But there is much more that goes into female psychopathy than just those traits of those disorders. So I want to
We
just
have
kind of
two.
make sure our listeners are aware of that.
We have at least two other episodes talking about that for people to refer back to. But when I think about this case, I'm skeptical that it will ever be solved. I think if it is solved, the thinker will have to get out of the false dichotomy. Either she was faking or either it was real, because it could have been a combination of both. And then, I think about the case of Jack the Ripper. This is the other thing where if some people think these letters where he kind of he got himself involved more or less in the investigation by taunting the police. That's a sign really of an organized killer in the FBI scenario of disorganized and organized. But a lot of people think those were not done by him. And once you eliminate that and look at this last victim, you really get a guy that's a disorganized killer. And you get somebody with a history of mental illness, hates women. Um, uh, you look at that last crime scene for him where he just mutilated the body, playing with the internal parts and so forth. A lot of people think the only reason he didn't get caught is he was lucky. that people came across the last victim. There's no dumping of the bodies. There's no stalking. And when you do that and eliminate some of the evidence that may not be associated with the crime, you end up with one suspect, which was this guy named Aaron Kaminsky, a history of mental illness. So should this case ever be solved, that will be part of the issue. Not looking at it as either or and eliminating things that aren't really relevant to the crime, because there's too much stuff here that's inconclusive and too much competing things to get a clear picture.
Agreed. Yeah, I think kind of what we talked about with um, eliminating some of that. Hopefully, we get somebody that wants to solve the case, and hopefully, they've kept some of the evidence preserved to test to see if there's any DNA on it. That would be ideal, and hopefully, it does get solved in our lifetime.
What you're saying, Jason, 10 years from now, when Robin does his third episode on this subject, he's going to be able to name who did it and have it all figured out.
Well, I've done that.
Will you invite us back for that, Robin?
Oh, I would, definitely, because I've done update episodes for cases I've covered when they wound up being solved or have major developments. But this is one of the rare ones where I might have been able to talk about it with some experts and then it gets solved, which would make it a special one.
Yeah, yeah. So, any other closing comments or anything else anyone wants to add?
Just one thing that I want to point out. I remember Ozzy Caban, the private investigator, said that the one detail that made him believe that Cindy was legitimate was the one incident where her dog Heidi was abused and was found tied to the table and looked absolutely terrified. But he said that Heidi, once she was untied, the first thing she did was run right over to Cindy, and he's thinking to himself that if Cindy had done this to her dog, that dog would not have gone anywhere near her. But the fact that this was her form of comfort kind of was a sense that she was probably hurt by an outside party. And I feel the same way where the incidents where Cindy found three separate dead cats in her yard, like on three separate occasions. Like, I just can't picture her driving around, picking up random cats and murdering them and just leaving them in her yard. It just doesn't seem to fit the personality of someone who had this little dog that she cared for and was very protective of. So I've always cited that as one of the biggest pieces of evidence that she was legitimately being stalked and assaulted.
You know, Robin,
Sherlock Holmes. That Sherlock Holmes story.
That's an interesting point, because one of the ways to start looking at this case would be someone to point out all the things that are consistent and inconsistent and begin to make lists of these things and start to analyze it further.
Yeah.
Yes, and that would be a piece of information that wouldn't fit.
Yeah. Carl, any other concluding comments or?
Well, just an exhausting case and a tragic case.
Yes.
And I'm glad to have Robin on with us to talk about it.
Yes. Yes. Thanks again, Robin, for joining us. And yes, unfortunate, a tragic case. Again, we're filming on her what would have been her 82nd birthday, which is tragic in itself. And unfortunately, as the case kind of concluded, it was inconclusive. We also kind of are at that kind of conclusion. We just don't know the true or the real ending. So it's unfortunate. Hopefully, though, this sparks maybe someone to dig deep and we can update our listeners with something more positive in the future about it. But again, thank you both for joining us. Thank you for everyone for listening and watching. Feel free again to subscribe and like the video on YouTube or wherever you get podcasts. And we'll see you again next time. Thank you both. Take care.
All right, Jason. See you, Robin.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.